Well, hey there, and welcome back to HEIMLER's History. Now, we've been going through Unit 3 of the AP Government curriculum, and in this video, that means it's time to talk about the balance between majority and minority rights. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, well, then let's get to it. So in this video, we're going to try to do two things. First, explain how the government has responded to social movements, and second, explain how the Supreme Court has at times allowed the restriction of the civil rights of minority groups and at other times has protected those rights. So just like in the last video, this is a video about civil rights and how the civil liberties outlined in the Bill of Rights have been applied to Americans, or in some cases, how they have not been equally applied. So since we already talked about the various civil rights movements in the last video, let's begin by considering how the government has responded to those movements. One of the chief goals of the civil rights movement for Black Americans was to abolish segregation in society. Now, racial segregation had been made the law of the land by a landmark Supreme Court case called PLESSY v. FERGUSON in 1896. And as a result of that case, the court ruled that racial segregation was perfectly constitutional as long as the various facilities for Black people and white people were equal. And that was what became known as the separate but equal doctrine. So that decision was all that some states needed to pass laws that restricted Black Americans from restaurants and public facilities, and more to the point for this video, schools. So as the devotees of the civil rights movement reminded America, this segregated situation was in no way constitutional. When it came to segregation in schools, the Black schools were certainly separate from the white schools, but they were never equal in funding. Additionally, just by the mere fact of separation, Black students and parents were made to feel like they were second-class citizens. And so the Plessy case is a prime example of the court restricting the civil rights of a minority. Well, in 1954 and 1955, a series of cases under the heading of Brown v. the Board of Education came before the court to address this inequity in the school system. Now, since this is a required case, I've got a whole video devoted to it, so here let me just say that the Brown decision effectively overturned the separate but equal doctrine and ordered schools to be integrated. The court ruled that racial separation is inherently unequal, no matter the state of the various facilities and the staff, and they did so based on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And this is an example of the court upholding minority rights. So that's the court, but Congress also responded to these various civil rights movements as well. About a decade after the Brown decision, Congress passed two laws that upheld the rights of Black Americans. First was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal to discriminate against anyone on the basis of race. As a result of this, all the segregated facilities not covered by the Brown decision were required to integrate. Second, the next year saw the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made it illegal to discriminate against voters. You see, before this law went into effect, several states had enacted poll taxes or literacy tests that had to be paid or passed in order to vote. And this was a thinly veiled strategy to keep Black Americans out of the voting booth. But with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment, which officially outlawed poll taxes, Congress upheld the franchise for minorities. Now, I just have to say that although all this is true on paper, it's not as though civil rights have always been upheld since then. Even so, these responses from the federal government were good steps in the right direction. Now, on the front of the women's rights movement, Congress also acted to uphold the rights of women. Front and center here was Title IX of the Education Amendments Act in 1972. Now, the need for this law grew out of a glaring omission in the Civil Rights Act. In Title VI of that law, it explicitly bans discrimination with respect to federally funded programs like schools. And in the language of Title VI, it says that discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin is illegal. But all the women in America sat up and were like, really sounds like you missed something there. No, we got race, color, national origin. That's all the discrimination categories. Really? You can't think of one other group that has been the subject of discrimination? Yeah, I got nothing. Anyway, Title IX of the Education Amendments Act plugged up that omission from the Civil Rights Act by guaranteeing that discrimination of federally funded programs could not happen on the basis of sex as well as race. And one of the most visible outcomes of Title IX was the rise of women's sports programs in colleges. Okay, now let's discuss one other way that the government has responded to civil rights movements with respect to voting, and that has to do with the drawing of majority-minority districts. And a majority-minority district is a district in which the majority is a minority. Now remember from Unit 2 that every 10 years when the data comes in from the census, we find out where everyone is living, and congressional districts are redrawn in order to make sure that everyone is represented equally, which is to say, to make sure that every person's vote counts equally. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act made clear that districts could not be drawn in order to dilute the voting power of racial minorities. And that principle was upheld in the non-required case of Thornburg v. GINGLES, which I confess gives me great pleasure to say. Anyway, it turned out that North Carolina had drawn 7 new districts in which it was basically impossible for Black votes to be equal with white votes. And so the court struck that down as a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, thus protecting minority rights. But the court ruled in the other way in one of your required cases called Shaw v. Reno, on which, again, I have a whole video. The short story is that North Carolina drew 2 majority-minority districts, which is to say majority Black districts, and submitted the plan to the Justice Department for approval. And based on the Voting Rights Act, the Justice Department said, sounds good to us. But several North Carolina residents challenged these districts, which, to be fair, were drawn in very wonky shapes, saying that these majority-minority districts were drawn only to help black voters. The word for that, in case you forgot, is racial gerrymandering. Anyway, the court agreed and said that while the districts were definitely created with noble intentions, they were so bizarre that the only explanation is that they were racially motivated. And even if those districts were drawn to increase the power of black voters, districts drawn only with race in mind were deemed unconstitutional. So that's an example of the court ruling in favor of majority rights. Okay, thanks for watching. Click right here, grab my review packet, which is going to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. Additionally, if you were helped by this video and you want me to keep making them, then by all means subscribe and I shall oblige. Heimler out.